So I'll go back and kind of finish the roll toward the middle of class. Let me turn the little beeping thing off on my phone. All right. Oh, goodness, sorry. So we had talked about most of chapter 15, and then today we're going to talk about whether or not Reconstruction was a success or failure, but we'll finish talking about the notes first. So let me share those. And we were pretty much here, I believe. So we had talked about Johnson's presidency, impeachment, that sort of thing. Impeachment, that could probably come up in your answer, I suppose. So Johnson gets impeached, and we elect Grant for 2 terms. The book will talk a little more in depth about Grant than I will. If you're wondering, does he need to be in your answer? Probably a little, a little bit, but maybe more just the idea that we become less committed to the idea of Reconstruction during his presidency and more concerned about other things. And you can maybe mention what those other things are if you like. But Grant becomes president after Johnson. He'll get elected to 2 terms. Remember that the southern states haven't been allowed to vote as fully during these elections. So in the first one especially, you still have a lot of African American participation. You'll have less in the second, and then by the end of Grant's term, you really won't have African American participation. The forced acts are still being used during the Grant administration, especially the first term, not as much in the second. Those were the acts that allowed the governors of the 5 military districts to call for the Army to come in to protect voters during elections, to make sure African American men were being able to vote and they weren't being intimidated by the KKK. But in the second administration, when those governors asked for the troops to be sent in, Grant will increasingly tell them no, which is a sign that there is a decline, or the book calls it northern fatigue, for enforcing Reconstruction. Somebody in the last class was concerned that the book doesn't talk enough about how the North really wasn't in great support of African Americans and tended to have problems with racial violence toward African Americans in the North. This is true. I mean, and the book does mention a little bit in some of those extra little sections that you see like as little extra essays or questions or things like that. But because most African Americans lived in the South, they do talk more about what happens to African Americans in the South. And again, whoever writes your textbook has got to pick and choose what they put in there. So I don't think their goal is necessarily to show bias. It's really to, I guess, cover the things as proportionally as they think they should. But, you know, you got to deal with somebody else's decisions in the textbook because you didn't write your own. So me either. So it is tricky. And you know, I'll say this probably all through the class. I really think your textbook is a good place to start with your study of history. It's definitely not the whole story, and it's not designed to be. It's really kind of supposed to be a foundation where you start. That's also why I want you to read it, because if you don't read that book, you don't have any foundation at all. You just get bits and pieces from other places. Even if one of those places is me, you still need more than just what I tell you. But anyway. So Grant's less likely to send in troops in the second administration. And if you're wondering why is there declining support for Reconstruction? Thing number one, Grant is sick. We've talked about that a little. Maybe. He's dying of cancer by the end of the second term, and he wants to make sure his family's provided for. He gets a military pension, and the president doesn't get paid that much during that era. So he wants to write his memoirs and have them published to make sure that his family has a continual source of income. So he's distracted. His administration's a little bit corrupt. The book will give you some more details about that, but they're interested in taking bribes and making fake holding companies to bid on railroad contracts, and they're doing all kinds of sketchy things. Grant, personally not, but some people within his administration. But the main reason overall is the economy has changed. And well, it's not the main reason, but it's the big reason. The economy has changed and the economy is growing pretty dramatically. So both people and political parties are much more concerned about how to make money. You know, how can they do something to either get money for themselves, their party, their business, that kind of thing, which is why you see all the graft and corruption and bribes and fake holding companies, credit mobilier, that sort of thing. And the other thing is those people who were in charge of the Republican Party, who were incredibly committed to abolition, equal rights for former slaves, protection for former slaves, they're either dead or they're out of politics. So, I mean, you know, clearly Abraham Lincoln's no longer with us. Every member of his cabinet, of course, is out of politics at this point. So that older generation of people who controlled the party and used it to, in some ways, to end slavery. I know it's not the only thing they did, but they did, you know, there was a group of them who did use their party to end slavery. Those guys are gone. So the people who maybe have those slightly more altruistic motives, if you can, I assume you consider them altruistic. Not everybody during that era did, but I assume you do. You know, that's not the main focus of party politics anymore. Do we preserve slavery? Do we end it? Now it's how do we get money? Because it's the Gilded Age. And we'll talk a lot about that, you know, in the next chapter. So next week, more of that. So less support for Reconstruction. That all that talk was a sign that federal support for Reconstruction is declining. Supreme Court also refuses to require states to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments. There'll be court cases that suggest that only the federal government has to enforce those and that states may continue to discriminate. So they don't make black codes, segregation, Jim Crow laws. They don't make any of those things illegal. And then they'll further codify that as we go along, a big Supreme Court decision in 1896, which we'll talk about a lot, you know, later in this unit. So the federal government is less supportive of Reconstruction. The parties themselves are less supportive of Reconstruction. Also, the parties become much more important in politics during this era than the individuals. That's why, like, if I were to ask you to name presidents between, say, Grant and Teddy Roosevelt, it would be hard for you to name any presidents between Grant and Teddy Roosevelt. And it's not so much that you aren't great students of history, you might be. It's that those guys aren't really individually as important as the political parties. Parties really control politics during this time period. So the parties end up picking the nominees, and the nominees essentially will do what they're told. If they don't do what they're told, let me try again. If they don't do what they are told, the parties will just remove them and get someone else. So the parties picked Samuel Tilden as a Democrat and Rutherford B. Hayes as the Republican for the election in 1876, so after Grant's 2 terms. Now, no one's going to suggest to you, well, I'm not going to suggest to you, and you probably don't have any friends that would suggest this to you, that Tilden and Hayes were personally corrupt. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that either of them were. However, the parties are. When the election turns out to be incredibly close, what ends up happening is the Republican Party figures out which states they would need to win in the Electoral College. They're going to lose the popular vote. So they're trying to figure out which states do we need to win in the Electoral College. So they figure that out. And then the election counting is going pretty slowly. So they send some people there to help with the recount. And then magically they win all 3 of those states. And then they're going to win in the Electoral College. And then the Democrats get upset and go like, well, we're going to send people to help with recounts as well. So they send people, and then the Democrats magically win all 3 of those states. And then everybody cries corruption, the election's invalid, what are we going to do? And so if you're wondering, and maybe you are wondering this because, you know, our situation now is a little controversial with people talking about vote counts maybe being a little off. This has happened before many times. So not for the same reason, not for a pandemic, but this has happened before. So what is supposed to happen according to the Constitution is, if there's a contested election, it's supposed to go to the House of Representatives. So the election goes to the House of Representatives, and then they vote. And if you're wondering why the House of Representatives, they would just do a vote. Why? Because they most directly represent the population of the United States. So if the election doesn't lead to a valid result in the Electoral College, the Constitution says it should go to the House of Representatives. Now, this is essentially the unreconstructed South. So Southern states aren't getting to vote in large numbers. So the South is going to protest this idea because they say it's unfair to them. And they're going to say, we'll secede if you don't do something that makes more sense and is more fair to the South. And so the House of Representatives decides they'll just make a committee. So they make a committee of 15 people, 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, and that's not 15, is it? 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. So essentially the 1 independent is picking the president. The 1 independent goes off the committee, they replace him with a Republican, they vote 8-7 that the Republicans should win the presidency. And then of course the South has a fit again. It's like, oh my goodness, we're gonna secede, this is terrible, we're out of here. So they come up with something called the Bargain of 1877, the Bargain of 1877. Other sources sometimes call it the Compromise of 1877, but your book calls it the Bargain. Now, in this Bargain of 1877, here's what they decide. The Republicans will get the presidency. That's essentially the North. So Rutherford B. Hayes will become the president. They're going to nickname him Rutherfraud B. Hayes, which is kind of rude, but you know, it's politics, so stuff happens. So Rutherford B. Hayes will be the president. So the Republicans will get that. The Democrats, or the South, I noticed that I called them the South here, but it's essentially the Democrats, will get a cabinet member. It's going to be a Southern cabinet, Southern Democrat in the cabinet. That'll be the what is he? The Postmaster General. So they'll get the Postmaster General, and he'll be a Southerner. And if you're wondering, does the post office really matter? Probably more then than it does now, although I know I've seen the news and there's some dispute about mailing ballots and things like that. So the South, or the Southern Democrats, will get the Postmaster General. The South, or Democrats, will get a railroad from Texas to California. If you're wondering, does that matter? Yeah, it kind of does, because the Transcontinental Railroad had been much more of a northern route, even though I know it ended up in California, but Northern California. But I mean, it went through Illinois, which is definitely not the South, and then, you know, down through Utah and into Northern California. So the Southern Railroad will be important for commerce, no doubt. But the big deal is the thing in the capital letters. The South gets the end of military reconstruction. And if you're wondering to yourself, what is military reconstruction? That's where the North forced the South, because you know they lost the Civil War, to have 5 military districts rather than to re-elect their own governments. And those 5 military districts were governed by someone in the U.S. Army, and those states were not going to be allowed to hold elections however they wanted to until they ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments, which they never did. So the South gets the end of military reconstruction, which means they can go back to holding elections however they want to, and they can continue to create Jim Crow laws or segregation laws or black codes. They can continue to make sure that African Americans don't get to vote. So they can continue to repress, suppress the rights of African Americans in the South, and then reconstruct their governments however they see fit. And there's a lot of reasons that this happens, but Probably the two big ones are parties become more important than individuals in politics during this time period, and money becomes more important than parties. So people aren't concerned so much about protecting the rights of former slaves or right and wrong or states' rights versus federal rights. They're really concerned about how do we get money for our party from these corporations. And this is an era where you can just openly accept bribes because there aren't really laws against that yet. And this is the upcoming era, the Gilded Age, is the era where we create a whole bunch of laws to stop the things that they're doing during this era. So, long story short, I suppose, during the Grant administration, the North becomes less concerned about protecting former slaves, the rights of former slaves in the South, about letting them have equality, equal access to voting, protection of civil rights and citizenship. So the desire by the Republicans and the North to make sure African Americans are fully participating members of society declines over time. And then, you know, the end of it is clearly the bargain of 1877, where the North says, okay, we're done. Everything's fine in the South now. We'll just let the South promise to uphold civil rights and we'll end military reconstruction. And you have to imagine that when the North said, we'll just let the South promise to uphold civil rights in the South, you knew that they knew that that wasn't going to happen. They did know that it wasn't going to happen. So this is the sign that they're out. They're like, okay, we're done with Reconstruction. Let's move on. Equality was either achieved or it wasn't. We just don't care anymore, which might be a slight overstatement, but only a slight one. All right. Do you have any questions that you would like to ask about this before we start talking about the weekly question? The weekly question. Goodness. All right. Any questions? I'm going to stop sharing this for a second. All right. Just as a quick reminder, weekly questions. You don't have to turn them in this week. They're not necessarily due each week. They're all due on the same day. For these first three, they're due on the 18th, which is a Friday in 2 weeks from tomorrow. And the due dates are always 11:59, so essentially midnight, a minute before midnight. If you're a minute late or something, I won't care. If you are late, it will still let you turn things in. It is going to mark them as late. So, and I'll definitely notice, you know, when I look at it, if it was really late, if it was a little late, you know, that sort of thing, I'll notice. But it is going to mark stuff as late. Excuse me. You can, what else was I going to say? You have to turn them all in individually, but you can turn them in, you know, at the same time. And you'll have your quiz the last week of the unit, which is next week after. And that'll be available on the 16th through the 18th of September. And the expectation on the quiz is that you will answer all of the quiz questions at the same time. That's also going to be timed. It's not going to kick you out necessarily if you don't finish, but it is going to tell me how long you took. And again, the expectation is you just answer those all in one sitting without looking up the answers. That's supposed to be from memory. All right. And if you forget any of that stuff, all of that stuff is in the syllabus. If you look in the section where the calendars are, where it tells you, you know, when stuff is due, that's where you'll see probably the best detail about that. And then there's a little bit more explanation, you know, within the middle of the syllabus. And almost all the questions that I'm getting from you guys in emails have to do with grades. So I will probably consistently remind you, you know, to look at the syllabus to remind yourself. But, you know, I'll explain it for a couple more weeks. After a while, I'll probably stop and you're like, come on, guys. But first couple
Yeah.
weeks. All right.
What?
Uh-oh. Somebody's yelling at their kids. All right. Let's talk about the weekly question. Let me find the weekly question. All right. Goodness, if we had had school online when I was a kid, I cannot imagine what the world would have heard. I think about that a lot. Okay. Oh, these things I added last class, so they aren't really on the weekly question. Okay. So the weekly question is, was Reconstruction a success or a failure, or was it something in between? In your response, consider land policy, key legislation during presidential and radical Reconstruction, Southern politics, racial and political violence, and Northern fatigue with Reconstruction. Be sure, to make clear what you mean by success and failure. Okay. Now, first thing, your answer has to be longer than the question, and your answer has to include specific details. When I say specific details, it means names, events, places, people, dates. So, I mean, you know, who does what, when, and why. So it can't just be, well, you know, the North got tired, so they did the Compromise or Bargain of 1877, and then Reconstruction ended. You got to tell me who it was, what they stopped doing, what was in the bargain of 1877, why it mattered. So details and explanation are what I'm looking for here. Now, how you organize it is up to you, but somebody asked me last class, do we have to write and complete sentences, or can we just make a list? Write and complete sentences, please, please. Because if you just make a list, I'm not seeing details, I'm not seeing analysis, and I'm not seeing cause and effect. So I don't see how stuff relates to other stuff. You have to explain that, okay? This is also why I'm telling you that your answer probably is going to be at least a page long. But I mean, the good news is you know the question. So, and all of this stuff is in chapter 15 of your textbook, so you know where to look. I mean, it's right there for you. So what you have to do is choose what you put in the answer. Now, if you just talked about everything here, you could answer this in about 4 or 5 pages. I'm not expecting you to do that much. I'm really not. You don't need to write a 4 or 5 page essay every week, because that's a lot. But if I'm suggesting that you talk about land policies, some laws, Southern politics, racial and political violence, I'm trying to get you to talk about very specific things. So make sure that you do that. Now, anytime I'm asking you to talk about something, in this instance, Reconstruction, the first thing I'm going to want to know is, do you know what Reconstruction is? So I would start with defining Reconstruction. Tell me what it is, why it happened, when it happened, who was in charge of it, that sort of thing. So that by itself is probably a paragraph. I mean, it probably is. Then you would want to tell me stuff that was either successful or not. Now, what you'll want to do is decide how to organize this. Let me look at your question. Okay. Yep, weekly questions, they are not due at the end of this week, but if I were you, I would do 1 a week. I would not wait until the 17th and start all 3 of them, because you also have that quiz due on the 18th. So the weekly questions, there really is 1 per week. Yeah, and they're listed individually in the assignment section, but they're not due until the end of the unit. For you, I mean, for your peace of mind, if I were you, I'd do them 1 at a time for a couple of reasons. 1, if you put stuff off till the last minute, something always goes wrong. You're old enough to know this, all of you, whether you're 18 or 38, you know how this is. if there's a due date and you've got 3 questions plus my quiz, and they all have to be done by the 18th, that's also going to be the day your chem lab is due, and 3 of your kids get the flu, and the dog has babies in the sink or something. All the stuff's going to happen on the date that stuff's due. So do one of these a week, it'll make your life easier. Now, like if this week, you know, you had a bad week, you worked 60 hours, your kids were brats, that kind of stuff, don't do anything this week. Do 2 questions next week. You know, maybe your kids will be better and your week at work will be better. But I would try really hard not to turn everything in at midnight on the 18th, because you probably are not going to do the best quality of work, and it probably will put too much stress on you. But you know what your life is like. You know what your schedule's like, so you do you. I mean, do what you need to do.
When we submit the answer, do you mind if we just write in the right submission, or do you want us to start like a actual document and have a header, footer, name, and all that kind of stuff, or can we just write in the submission our answer?
I think you can just write it in the submission. I think that's fine. I think so. Yeah. And the truth is, I really know how it works on my end of the thing. So I'm not completely sure how it works on your end of the thing. I will tell you that last semester, I had some people who submitted stuff and I couldn't open it. So I would just email them and say, I can't open this, you need to resubmit it. So no matter what you do, if you write it, you know, write in the submission, I would copy and paste it into a document in case something goes wrong. Of course, you know, with technology, something goes wrong sometimes. So you probably save stuff anyway. But I would always save stuff just in case the submission doesn't work. That makes sense. All right, so back to the question, sorry. And then I'll try to, go ahead, sorry.
I have a question. So the only one we gotta do is chapter 15, right? Not 16, 17, only 15?
Well,
Because,
go
I
ahead.
was just wondering because, like, they all said the 18th. So I was like, just do all 3 and give them to you?
All 3 are due on the 18th.
Okay.
So you have to
That's
do
fine.
all 3. You have to do all 3 of them. This week we're going to talk about one each week because we go over 1 chapter a week. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but the structure of the calendar. Each week we do 1 chapter. You have a weekly question, so that weekly question is over the 1 chapter that we do that week. Part of the reason I also think you should turn in the question each week is we just covered it, so it's kind of fresh in your mind. Also, if you turn them in 1 at a time, you'll get feedback on the first one before you do the second and third one. So you do the first one and I don't think it had enough detail, you'll know on the second one you need more detail. If you turn all 3 of them in on the 18th, you're probably going to get the same type of feedback on all 3 of them. So, you know, it'll give you a little bit of a heads up on things you might be able to do to improve your grades as you go. But they're all you have to do all 3 of them. They're each worth 10 points each. And they're all due on the 18th, but you can turn them in before. You turn them in individually. And then your quiz will be worth 30 or 40 points. And then it's also due on the 18th. And the quiz will be over chapters 15, 16, and 17. So a chapter a week. After 3 or 4 chapters, we pause and you have a quiz. And that quiz is due the last Friday of that week. The weekly questions, there's 1 per chapter. So the first unit has 3 weekly questions. Unit 2 has 4. Unit 3 has 4. Unit 4 has 3. And then your quizzes are 8. The first quiz at least is 8 to 10 questions. And then we'll revisit that after the first quiz and see if you'd rather there were more questions. I won't make it fewer because, you know, that's not very many questions for 3 chapters, but I could potentially make it more if you wanted it to be more. But I'm not even going to ask you that until you take the quiz because, you know, at first it just sounds good to have fewer questions. but you may want more because, you know, then they're worth fewer points and you can miss more. So, all right. So back to the weekly question, which you can turn in before the 18th, but you don't have to. And you have to do all 3 weekly questions for the unit, okay? So after you've defined reconstruction, you've said what it is, when it is, where it happens, why it happened. Then you want to talk about whether it worked or it didn't. Now, there are a couple of ways you could go about that. You could talk about the stuff that happens in reconstruction chronologically, like this happened, and in this way that was good. This happened in this way that was bad. You know, you could go through it chronologically. Or you could organize it where you had a paragraph about stuff that happens that is good in reconstruction and talk about that. Or a paragraph, and then a paragraph that talks about what was bad in reconstruction, and then talk about, you know, describe those things. There are other ways you can do it as well. You don't have to organize it either of those ways. You could talk about the reconstruction during the Johnson administration and then talk about reconstruction during the Grant administration. You can organize it however you like, as long as you organize it, as long as there's some logic to how you go about it. There's certain things that I'm going to expect that show up in your answer, okay? I've already told you reconstruction, definition. I would like to see that. And I've also, you know, in your conclusion, you'll have to explain what you mean by when you say it was a success or a failure. So, you know, you could say that it was a success because we added 3 amendments to the Constitution, and even though they weren't necessarily well enforced during that time period, becomes a permanent part of the law. So, you know, that in that way is a success. You could talk about certain people that came out of Reconstruction who were government leaders or influencers, especially African Americans from the South, who would have never had that opportunity without Reconstruction. But certain specific things, and then I'll look at your question, I promise, certain specific things that I think have to be in this answer. The amendments. We don't amend the Constitution very often. So when I've said key legislation, amendments, you have to talk about those. There are other pieces of legislation you could and should talk about, and when you talk about the amendments, don't just say, we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. Mention what they do. The other thing that I think has to be in this answer, just has to be in this answer, and I think I kind of threw a fit about it in the last class, but I didn't type it, is you have to mention that Reconstruction, oops, sorry. I hate typing in front of people. I'm the worst typist ever. Reconstruction ends with the bargain of 1877. And then you need to tell me what that is. Okay. All right, let me look at your questions. Okay, I don't care if you double space or single space, doesn't matter. Okay. What if I had a yes, no type of question? What if, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. So, you know, on this one, it doesn't have to be yes, it was successful, or no, it wasn't, because, you know, this was it something in between is an option as well. And most of you are going to say it was something in between. My guess is just, you know, from grading something similar, not exactly the same thing, but something similar over the summer, most people are going to say, well, parts of it were successful, or parts of it were good, parts of it were bad. In the short term, it was not successful. In the long term, it was, because of, you know, what eventually happened, but it didn't happen at the time we expected it to happen. You'll say it better than that. But you can say there's complete success because it changed the Constitution and allowed for something to happen in the future that was important. You can say it was a complete failure because the goal of Reconstruction was to make sure that former slaves had the same rights as whites, and that clearly didn't happen. But most of you will say it's somewhere in the middle, because some good stuff came out of it, and then some other stuff there was a promise of equality that wasn't fulfilled. So my guess is most of you will say it was somewhere in between, but you could argue that it was a complete success or complete failure, and you could do that convincingly, but you still have to mention stuff that worked and stuff that didn't, no matter if your conclusion was it was a complete success or complete failure. But that's where the make sure you are clear by how you define success and failure, so you can justify that. But you still have to tell me. You can't ignore stuff just because it doesn't fit your conclusion or your argument. Don't do that, okay? And if you were wondering, presidential reconstruction, that's where you would probably, if you talk about that very specifically, that's really just Andrew Johnson pardoning all the Confederates and letting them back in. Radical Reconstruction was the Congress's version of Reconstruction, which turns into military Reconstruction, the 5 districts. Southern politics, when you're talking about that, they're really talking about black codes and restrictions on voting rights and other rights for African Americans. Racial and political violence, this is primarily the rise of the KKK, but it could be other stuff as well. I do think that that probably has a place in your answer somewhere, the rise of, creation of the KKK. Northern fatigue, that's where we're talking about the Grant administration. People go like, hey, we spend enough time and money on this. They just need to figure it out. We go through periods like that in our history. It's just, normally it has to do with, like, I don't know, Vietnam. There was a certain point where we just said this thing's not worth it anymore. Cold War, I think we may have gotten to that point a little bit with the Cold War. We'll talk about that later. But we definitely get that way with Reconstruction, for sure. Sorry, somebody's at my door. So, Southern politics, racial, political violence, Northern fatigue with Reconstruction. And I really think you have to talk about the bargain of 1877, because that's why Reconstruction ends. That's why it ends. And, mention who gets what. So I had people who tried to answer this with bullet points, and I've already mentioned to you I'm not okay with that, because you're not explaining stuff, you're not showing cause and effect relationships. So I think you've got to talk very specifically about the what happened, and then tie those whats to why it was important. If you write this whole answer and you never say why something was important, or you never define success or failure, that's a problem. Yeah, in land policy, you can talk about sharecropping, crop lien system, and you could even talk, because somebody in the last class said, can we talk about where they actually redistributed some land, even though it was before the Civil War? And sure, before Reconstruction, you absolutely can talk about that. And thanks for mentioning that. I did forget to say land policy. So yeah, you can talk about redistribution of land, the 40 acres and a mule idea, and what actually happened in the Carolinas and Georgia, right as the Civil War ended, and sharecropping, crop lien system. You could talk about that, about the difficulties of Reconstruction if you didn't own land. And I'm going to always suggest to you, or anybody that would ever care to hear my opinion about it, the failure of Reconstruction really has to do with a bunch of people being freed without assets. So, you free a whole bunch of folks who work their whole lives without getting paid, but then don't give them any money or land, it's going to be hard for them to be successful. So this is the era where they have a fairly serious discussion of reparations, about what slaves should be paid for being slaves, what sort of, I don't know, I guess we would think of it in a modern way more like winning a lawsuit. You were enslaved your whole life. What damages are you owed? This is the era where the damages needed to be paid for people to have, chance at future economic success. Now, I would be foolish to argue that in spite of the lack of redistribution of resources, that people were not successful coming out of Reconstruction. And you're going to find, a handful of people that the book talks about who are enormously successful, who become wealthy, who start colleges, who become senators, who get elected to their state Congress, that sort of thing. There are people who are enormously successful and influential in spite of the unfairness of Reconstruction. So, you know, those guys deserve a mention as well. It's just, it makes not redistributing the land makes it difficult for the average person in the South to have a chance at economic success. And I know some of you are thinking, well, how fair is it to redistribute land? I'm not really talking about socialism here, which, you know, you may or may not like. What I'm talking about is a guy that owned 300 people, which isn't very fair either. So when that guy, when the war's over and his side loses, the thought was that guy is going to lose his plantation. And they really don't end up redistributing very much plantation land. The one guy who really did lose his plantation was Robert E. Lee. They made the Arlington National Cemetery out of his plantation. It was moderately interesting if you're ever, that's your trivia for the day. All right. I am so tired of talking. Are you tired of listening to me? Proper answer there is no. We are never tired of listening to you. Do you guys have any questions you would like to ask at this moment? I'm going to go to the stop sharing part. And then look at the chat. Okay. Anything you guys want to ask? Okay, while you guys are thinking about it, I'm going to look at my roll sheet and tell you who I didn't see, and then you can tell me if you're here. Did we have Kevin Bakos? Is he here? This is where you have to answer. Or type into the chat, maybe. All right, did we get Marco Cervantes? I did not see that person. Did we get Calvin Coffey? Probably need to go and update my thing. And Eric Constantino. And Kennedy Onyema. I see you. So you can say something if you want, but I see you and checked you off. All right. And Christian Limon. Okay. All right then. Marco, oh, I see you now. You're just Marco. You're like Prince or other people. Share. I saw somewhere, it must have been one of those weird magazines, that's a lie, that she was getting married. I don't think that's probably true. Madonna, it's another one-name person. LeBron is kind of a one-namer. All right. Any questions that you guys want to ask? I guess I should stop recording while I talk about Madonna and Cher. All right then, so you're fairly clear on, if I were you and you have time over the weekend, I would do the question about Reconstruction. I would. But it's up to you. And if you submit it, I'll grade it, okay? And I know someone already told me they submitted it. I still have, I'm sorry, I got busy and I didn't go back and look to grade it. And tomorrow morning I've got something to do, but tomorrow afternoon, yeah, I could look at it tomorrow afternoon. Or Saturday, honestly, it'd probably be Saturday. Okay, what else was I gonna tell you? I know you don't know the answer. Oh, I put in the course documents section the list of things to study for the quiz. So now you've got the 3 weekly questions, the list of things to study for the quiz. I would have those handy while you read the textbook. So that way you'll know what to take notes over, highlight, that sort of thing. I don't really have official office hours, but we could figure out, like, if you wanted to talk to me, if you want to send me an email and say, like, hey, can we have a little Zoom meeting at this time, you know, give me some options, and I would say yes or no. And what I've been doing is, like, we're going to end class here in the next couple of minutes. I will also stay on after we end class. And then if you want to ask questions, you could ask questions. And if it would be easier, I could make official office hours. It's just, I figure you guys aren't all available at the same time anyway. I don't know what to tell you. But if you ever want to do like I want to ask you questions over Zoom kind of thing, just send me an email and propose a couple times. I teach pretty much all day, Tuesday, Thursday, but if you wanted to go like really early or after 4, so really early, by really early, I mean 8. I don't mean 6 a.m. Sorry. Yeah. So like 8 in the morning or 4 in the afternoon on Tuesday, Thursday. But I don't have class on Monday, Wednesday. So I have more flexibility on those days. So, all right. All right then. Anything else you want to ask? All right, then I'm going to say that we're officially done with class. And if you want to stay behind and ask a question, feel free. Hopefully you guys have a lovely afternoon. Again, stay behind and ask questions if you would like to. Thank you for coming to class. Stay safe, take care of yourselves. Thank you. You guys have a good weekend as well. Send me an email if you have questions and I will answer your emails. And apologies if I overlooked an email. All right, you guys have a good day. Stay by or stay back and ask questions if you like. Oh, I gotta stop recording too.